The Langston estate stood like a wounded creature at the edge of the Mississippi woods, its spine of decaying beams jutting out against the pale horizon. The townsfolk avoided it, not because of superstition but because of memory. The Langstons had been a powerful family once, their wealth rooted in the black soil and their name whispered with a kind of fearful reverence. But with time came rot, and with rot came rumor. It was said that every son born into the Langston bloodline married his sister, not in defiance of law or sanity, but as part of something much older, something written in the family's bones. The discovery of the old ledger begins with the dull creak of the Langston estate's study door, a sound that carries through the halls like the echo of a forgotten confession. The room smells of mildew and ink, its air heavy with the silence of things that once mattered. A historian named Evelyn Carter has been granted rare access to the property, hoping to unearth traces of Southern history buried beneath decades of decay. She doesn't come searching for curses or ghost stories, only records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, property deeds. But history, as she soon learns, has a way of unearthing its own ghosts. In the bottom drawer of an oak desk, beneath a layer of dust and a scatter of brittle moth wings, Evelyn finds a thick leather-bound ledger. Its spine is cracked, its cover embossed with the initials L.F. And though it is brittle with age, the ink inside looks almost freshly dried. She runs her fingers down the yellowed pages, expecting lists of trades or estate inventories. Instead, she finds marriage records, dozens of them, each entry meticulously written in elegant cursive, each one connecting a man named Langston to a woman of the same surname. At first, she assumes it must be clerical error or coincidence, a repetition of family names across generations. But as she reads further, she begins to notice something else. The names repeat too precisely, the handwriting never changes, and each union is sealed with the same signature. By the grace of the Langston blood. The phrase unsettles her. It isn't the language of law or religion, it's a vow of something else, something binding beyond mortal understanding. She traces the earliest entry, dated 1814, and realizes it matches the year the Langston family first took ownership of the estate. From that moment, every generation has mirrored the last, each son marrying a woman whose birth records seem to appear out of nowhere. There are no maiden families, no parent names, no birthplaces, just Langston. The deeper Evelyn reads, the colder the air grows around her. The last few pages are written in trembling ink, as if the hand that wrote them fought against itself. The final entry bears the name of Jonathan's father, his marriage recorded in the same strange phrase, and below it, a space left blank, as though waiting for the next name to be written. A sudden draft flips the ledger closed, and Evelyn feels, for a brief and paralyzing moment, that the house itself is watching her. In her chest, something twists, a realization that she may have uncovered not just a family's history, but its heartbeat, one that refuses to die even after the last of the bloodline has returned home. Jonathan Langston returned to the family estate under a heavy sky, the kind that seemed to sag with memory. The gravel road leading to the mansion had swallowed most of its shape, overgrown with wild grass and roots that crawled like fingers across the earth. He hadn't been back in over 15 years, not since his father's funeral when the air itself had felt thick with something unsaid. Now, standing before the house again, he felt that same unspoken presence, like walking into a memory that never wanted to fade. He told himself he came only to sell what was left of the property, to settle the papers, to close the book on the Langston name. Yet, as the wind moved through the dead trees and the shutters beat faintly against the walls, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being welcomed back, not as a visitor but as someone expected. The caretaker, an old man named Ellis, met him at the gate with wary eyes. "It's good to have a Langston home again," he muttered, though his tone carried no warmth. Inside, the house had aged cruelly. Wallpaper peeled like old skin, chandeliers hung crooked, and the scent of damp wood lingered beneath the dust. In the parlor, Jonathan found portraits of ancestors staring down with eerily similar faces. High cheekbones, sharp eyes, lips drawn too tightly. He noticed how the women in the paintings shared features that mirrored the men beside them, As though each generation had been carved from the same mold, the door to the portrait room resisted Jonathan's hand as though it had not been opened in decades. The brass knob was cold, and the hinges moaned when he finally pushed it inward, releasing a gust of stale air that smelled faintly of oil paint and decay. Dust floated in thick ribbons through the fractured light that seeped from a single, grimy window. The room was lined from floor to ceiling with paintings, each framed in dark mahogany that had long lost its polish. At first glance, they seemed ordinary family portraits. Stern men, composed women, all dressed in the finery of past centuries. But as Jonathan stepped closer, a chill crawled up his spine. The faces were wrong. Every couple shared the same haunting symmetry, husband and wife almost identical in feature and expression, their pale eyes catching the dim light in a way that made them appear alive. Some were separated by generations of clothing styles, yet their resemblance was unnatural, as if time had copied the same faces again and again with only minor imperfections. He stood before one in particular, a painting dated 1841, the year his great-great-grandfather had married. The woman's hand rested lightly on her husband's shoulder, and though the brushwork was fine, her gaze seemed almost pleading, caught between love and horror. Jonathan leaned closer and felt his heart stutter. The texture of the paint shifted beneath his eyes, as though it was still wet. Her pupils seemed to contract at his movement, her painted lips curving ever so slightly into something that wasn't quite a smile. He stumbled back, brushing against another canvas behind him, and the frame rattled as though something inside had stirred. The sensation of being watched thickened until it was almost physical. The air turned heavy, pressing down on him with the weight of unspoken history. At the far end of the room, a larger portrait dominated the wall, his father's. It was the only one shrouded with a black veil. Against his better judgment, Jonathan reached out and pulled the cloth away. Beneath it, his father stood beside a woman who looked disturbingly familiar. Not because he recognized her, but because she bore his own features, softened into a feminine reflection. Her eyes were his eyes, her mouth his mouth, painted with chilling precision. A tremor ran through him as he stepped back, the fabric slipping from his fingers. The silence in the room deepened, thick and alive, and for a moment he thought he heard the faintest whisper come from behind the canvas. A woman's voice, low and sorrowful, saying his name as though reminding him that he, too, belonged on the wall. The attic was a graveyard of forgotten things, the air dense with the scent of dust, cedar, and something faintly sweet like dried flowers. Jonathan had climbed there following a strange draft that seemed to whisper through the cracks of the house at night, leading him to the uppermost corner where even the caretaker refused to go. The wooden stairs groaned under his weight, each creak echoing through the empty corridors below. When he reached the top, his lantern's dim light revealed shapes under old sheets, furniture, trunks, and boxes stacked like tombstones. But what drew his attention most was a tall object at the far end, draped in heavy black cloth. It stood upright, almost human in form, and as the light flickered across it, Jonathan felt the strange pull of familiarity, the way one recognizes their own shadow before seeing it. He hesitated before pulling the cloth away, and for a moment, he could almost hear a whisper, a single breath that wasn't his own. When the fabric fell, it revealed an antique mirror framed in ornate silver, its surface clouded by age yet still faintly reflective. The glass rippled slightly, as if disturbed by water, and Jonathan's reflection appeared pale and uncertain in the dim light. But there was someone else standing beside him. A woman. Her form was faint at first, no more than a suggestion of light and shadow, yet her presence was unmistakable. She was tall, graceful, with long hair that moved though the air was still. Her face was soft, and her eyes carried an expression that was neither kind nor cruel, just knowing. Jonathan spun around, but the space beside him was empty. When he looked back into the mirror, the woman was closer. The faint trace of a smile curved her lips, though they didn't move when she spoke. "You've come home," she said, the voice echoing softly inside his skull, not in the air. His pulse thundered in his ears. He stumbled back, but the reflection stayed perfectly still, his figure retreating, hers unmoving, as though the glass contained a different world with its own rules. The lantern flickered violently, casting her image in and out of sight, and for an instant, Jonathan saw her reach toward him. Her fingers pressed against the glass from the inside, leaving a faint, fogged imprint. He dropped the lantern, and darkness swallowed the room except for the faint glow from the mirror. When the flame finally steadied again, the woman was gone, but the imprint of her hand remained, cold and fresh, as though she had only just withdrawn. As the first night deepened, the silence of the house became restless. The ticking of the old clock seemed louder than before, and the shadows along the walls stretched in unnatural directions. Jonathan poured himself a drink to calm his nerves, but even the whiskey burned differently here, sharp and metallic, as if it had absorbed the taste of the house. When he mentioned the marriage rumors to Ellis the next morning, the old caretaker grew pale and muttered, "Best not to stir what's buried." Jonathan laughed it off, pretending not to notice how the man's hands trembled when he spoke. But the words lingered like a splinter in his thoughts. Each night, he dreamed of wedding bells and the scent of lilies, of a woman whose face he could never clearly see standing by his side whispering his name. He awoke to find the air thick with perfume, the kind his mother used to wear, though her things had been gone for years. The more he tried to dismiss the strangeness, the more the house seemed to pulse with awareness, as if it knew that the last Langston had returned, and that the story of his blood was far from over. Jonathan couldn't sleep after the incident in the attic. The image of the woman in the mirror haunted him, her eyes filled with something that felt too familiar to dismiss. The next morning, driven by a need to understand, he began searching through the old chests and drawers scattered across the estate. Many were filled with ruined fabrics, rusted trinkets, and family relics too brittle to touch. But one wooden trunk, small and carved with initials worn almost to invisibility, caught his attention. It was tucked beneath a broken cradle in what had once been a nursery. The lock had rusted through, and when he pried it open, the scent of lavender and mold spilled out. Inside lay a collection of letters, yellowed photographs, and a small journal bound in soft brown leather, its edges chewed by time. Written across the inside cover was a single name, Mary Langston, his great-grandmother. He began reading by the window, where the pale light made the faded ink barely legible. The first pages were ordinary, filled with daily musings about the estate, her husband, and the quiet loneliness of the vast house. But as the entries went on, her tone shifted, growing fragmented, almost frantic. One night, she wrote of the sound of crying echoing through the halls when no one else was awake. She spoke of dreams filled with blood and mirrors, of a woman who looked just like her standing at her bedside. Then, in an entry dated March 4, 1893, Mary described the night she gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. The girl, she claimed, was born still, yet Mary swore she saw the infant's eyes open and look directly at her before closing forever. The doctor dismissed it as grief-induced delirium, but Mary insisted the child's spirit never left. In later entries, she wrote that as her son grew, he often spoke to someone she could not see. He called her sister, and sometimes the mirror in the nursery fogged as though another breath had joined his own. Mary grew terrified, certain that something ancient had bound the two children together. Her last entry ended abruptly. They say our blood must remain pure. They say one cannot live without the other. But if they ever meet again, it will not be by chance. The house will bring them together. Jonathan closed the journal with shaking hands, his reflection trembling faintly in the nearby window. Somewhere deep in the house, a child's laughter echoed once, soft and distant, as if someone was listening and pleased that he had finally found the truth. The first time Jonathan heard the bells, it was just past midnight. The sound drifted faintly through the thick air of the house, soft at first, almost mistaken for the creaking of old wood. But as the minutes passed, the sound grew clearer, a slow, deliberate toll like a church bell calling its congregation. The problem was, there was no church nearby, and the Langston family chapel had been abandoned for more than 100 years. Jonathan sat up in bed, the faint vibration of the bells echoing in his chest as if the sound were coming from within the house itself. He tried to ignore it, convincing himself it was the wind playing tricks on the structure. But when he looked toward the window, the trees outside were still. The air was utterly silent except for that slow, rhythmic chime that seemed to seep through the walls. He followed the sound down the hallway, barefoot, the wooden floor cold beneath him. The mansion was cloaked in shadows, and each flicker of the lantern cast strange shapes on the walls. The bells grew louder as he neared the western wing, the oldest part of the house, sealed off since before his father's time. The double doors to the chapel were covered in dust, yet faint footprints, too small to be his, marked the path leading to them. His hand trembled as he turned the rusted handle. The hinges screamed when the doors opened, revealing a chapel swallowed by darkness. The pews were cracked, the altar half collapsed, and vines had crept through shattered stained glass. But above it all, suspended from the ceiling, the old bell rope hung swaying gently as though someone had just released it. The ringing stopped the moment he stepped inside. The silence that followed was heavier than before, pressing against his chest until he could hear his heartbeat over it. Then, faintly, a whisper brushed against his ear. A woman's voice murmuring, "You're late." He spun around, the lantern trembling in his grasp, but no one was there. The air grew colder, his breath fogging in front of him, and from the altar came a flicker of light, like the reflection of candle flames that didn't exist. For a heartbeat, he saw figures standing among the pews, shadowy outlines of men and women dressed in old wedding garments, their heads bowed as if attending a ceremony that had never ended. The vision vanished as quickly as it came, leaving the air thick with the scent of lilies. When Jonathan stumbled back into the hallway, he heard the bells one last time, tolling softly behind him, as though marking not the hour, but the beginning of something ancient stirring awake. Jonathan's growing unease finally drove him to seek answers beyond the decaying walls of the estate. He visited the town's oldest church the following morning, a weathered building crouched on the edge of the cemetery where the Langston family tombstones leaned like weary sentinels. The priest there, Father Whitlock, was an aging man with a trembling voice and eyes that seemed to carry too much knowledge. When Jonathan introduced himself, the old man's expression changed instantly. Recognition, then pity, then fear. "I thought the Langstons were all gone," he said quietly, his fingers tightening around the crucifix at his chest. Jonathan explained the strange occurrences, the bells, the mirror, the woman's reflection, and showed him the entries from Mary Langston's journal. The priest's face turned pale as he read, and after a long silence, he closed the book and whispered, "Your family made a promise long ago, a dark one." He told Jonathan of an old tale passed down among the town's elders, a legend they were warned never to repeat aloud near the estate. Generations ago, the first Langston patriarch had been a wealthy landowner facing ruin after a drought destroyed his crops and the family fortune began to crumble. Desperate to preserve his legacy, he turned to a wandering preacher rumored to practice forbidden rites. In exchange for eternal prosperity, the preacher demanded a union of pure reflection, a bond that would keep the Langston blood unbroken and their wealth untouched by outsiders. The patriarch, blinded by greed and fear, agreed. The curse, or covenant, depending on how one looked at it, was sealed in blood on the family's chapel altar. Every son born thereafter was bound to marry his own reflection, not in a symbolic sense, but in a twisted echo of the pact, a soul doubled through the bloodline, destined to repeat itself. Those who tried to resist either vanished or died before their wedding day. Jonathan listened, torn between disbelief and a cold, creeping acceptance that everything he had seen aligned too perfectly with the story. The priest warned him not to stay another night at the estate, saying the curse awakened each time a new Langston heir returned. But Jonathan couldn't leave, not without understanding who the woman in the mirror was, and why she looked so much like him. Before he left, Father Whitlock handed him an old iron key. "If you wish to break what was made," the priest whispered, "you must find where it began. Beneath the chapel lies what your family tried to bury." The words echoed in Jonathan's mind as he drove back through the mist, the estate rising ahead like a scar he could no longer ignore. The nights grew longer after Jonathan's visit to the priest, the air inside the Langston estate turning colder even when the fire burned. He began noticing her more often, the pale woman from the mirror. At first, she appeared only in reflections. In the glass of a framed photograph, in the shimmer of the hallway window at dusk, in the silver surface of a spoon. Sometimes she was distant, standing in the far corner of the room as if watching quietly. Other times she was closer, her features soft but hauntingly familiar. Eyes that mirrored his own, a mouth that curved with a sadness that almost looked like affection. The first time she spoke, it was not with her lips but with his thoughts. He was standing in front of the attic mirror again, the same one he had uncovered days earlier. Her reflection appeared beside him, her hand brushing against his in the glass though he felt nothing. Her voice filled his mind, a whisper so gentle it felt like breath. "You've come back to me, Jonathan." He wanted to pull away, to leave the room, but something stronger than fear held him there. Her presence was magnetic, almost tender, as though she wasn't a ghost but something long forgotten and deeply bound to him. "Who are you?" he managed to whisper aloud. Her reflection smiled faintly. "I am what you are, what they made us to be." He blinked, and she was gone, leaving the mirror empty except for his own trembling reflection. That night, he dreamt of her more vividly than ever before. Standing beneath the chapel's broken arches, dressed in a white gown that shimmered like water. Her eyes were wet with tears, and she extended her hands toward him. "You left me," she said softly, and behind her, shadows moved like a congregation waiting for a ceremony to begin. Over the following days, Jonathan felt her presence even when he was awake. The scent of lilies followed him through the halls, doors creaked open without wind, and faint footprints appeared in the dust beside his own. Once, when he reached out to close a window, her reflection appeared in the glass again, and this time he heard her voice clearly, echoing through the room. "They called it love," she whispered, "but it was never ours to choose." The sound of her sorrow wrapped around him, and for a fleeting second, he pitied her more than he feared her. But deep down, he sensed what she truly wanted, to complete what had been left unfinished, to pull him fully into her world so that the curse could bind itself once more. The night of his father's death anniversary arrived with an unnatural stillness, as if the air itself was holding its breath. The house was colder than usual, the fire refusing to stay lit, and every clock had stopped just before midnight. Jonathan sat alone in the parlor, staring at the portrait of his father and the woman who looked like him, her painted eyes glimmering faintly in the candlelight. He tried to convince himself that it was only grief and sleeplessness shaping his mind into nightmares, but deep down he felt the truth. The house was waiting. Outside, the wind began to hum like distant chanting, and from somewhere deep within the walls came the faint toll of wedding bells. He stood, his body moving without command, drawn toward the western wing where the chapel lay beneath centuries of dust. The old iron key Father Whitlock had given him seemed to burn in his pocket as if urging him forward. When he reached the chapel doors, they opened before he could touch them. Inside, the ruined sanctuary glowed faintly, candles burning on their own accord, casting trembling light over the rotted pews and broken altar. And there she was, the woman from the mirror, dressed in a white gown that looked almost woven from mist, her face pale but radiant, her eyes wet with sorrow and longing. "It's time," she said softly, her voice both inside and around him. Jonathan felt his heartbeat slow, his limbs moving as though under a spell. He approached her, unable to resist, his hands trembling as she reached out. "You were promised to me," she whispered, and in her voice, he heard centuries of repetition, the echo of every Langston who had come before him. Shadows filled the pew's figures of men and women dressed as wedding guests, their faces hollow but smiling. The chapel began to shimmer, its decay replaced by fleeting glimpses of its past glory. Fresh flowers, golden light, the faint scent of incense and lilies. He realized he was standing not in ruins but in memory. The mirror he had seen in the attic now stood behind the altar, tall and gleaming, its surface rippling like liquid silver. As the woman led him toward it, he saw not his reflection but two figures standing hand in hand. Himself and her, their faces merging slowly into one. Terror surged through him, but with it came defiance. He wrenched his hand free and seized a fallen candelabrum, hurling it into the mirror. The glass exploded with a scream that wasn't human, shards slicing through the air like silver rain. The reflection dissolved, the light dimmed, and the woman's voice faded into a broken whisper, repeating his name until the sound melted into silence. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, pale and trembling, as Jonathan stumbled out of the chapel. His hands were cut from the shattered glass, his clothes torn and dusted with ash. Behind him, the Langston estate groaned as if it had taken a breath for the first time in centuries. Then came the sound, a low, guttural rumble from deep within the walls, followed by the slow collapse of beams and the crackling hiss of fire. Flames erupted from the chapel roof, spreading through the old corridors like veins of light tearing through darkness. The air filled with the smell of smoke and burning wood, mingled with something older, a scent that reminded him of damp soil and decay. He turned to run, but his legs felt heavy, as though the house itself resisted his escape. Through the rising heat, he saw faces flickering in the flames. Faint and sorrowful, hundreds of them, men and women whose features bore the same cursed resemblance, their eyes soft with release rather than vengeance. The ground trembled as the roof of the chapel gave way. The mirror lay in shattered pieces, glowing faintly before melting into blackened glass. Jonathan stumbled into the cold morning air, collapsing on the overgrown path leading away from the house. From a distance, the Langston estate no longer looked like a home but a pyre, its windows glowing like eyes finally closing. As the fire consumed the walls, the earth beneath the chapel split open with a dull, echoing crack. The ground fell away to reveal what lay hidden for generations. A chamber filled with countless remains, bones arranged in rows like a congregation in eternal worship. The truth struck him with sickening clarity. These were the brides, the reflections. Women who had never truly lived outside the curse's illusion, buried beneath the chapel as offerings to preserve the family's bloodline. The morning sun rose higher, and with it came silence. The fire died without wind or water, leaving only blackened ruins and drifting ash that settled on the graves around the estate. Jonathan watched as the final plume of smoke curled upward, dissolving into the light, and for the first time, he felt the weight of the air lift. The curse was broken, the voices gone, and the house, once a prison of endless repetition, was finally still. In the silence that followed, only the wind remained, whispering softly through the charred trees, carrying with it the faint toll of distant wedding bells fading into